Fox, back again with my colleague Lola for another episode. Today, we're absolutely thrilled to have Pana Ratanabanangkoond. I hope that's close. As our guest, I'm going to go with Pana. So, Pana, first of all, welcome on behalf of both of us. And thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us today.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks, Lola.
Pana, could you tell us a little bit about your professional background?
Sure, Tom. So I started working about 30 years ago in the industry with Shell in particular, and had the opportunity to work with Shell in many positions in Thailand, the US, the UK, and in Singapore before I moved back here. And a lot of exciting assignments in traditional oil and gas as well as renewable energy business. I decided about 7 years ago that I'd like to move back to Thailand for several reasons. Um, During the time I was away, every time I visit my home country, it's always the same recurring problems: air pollution, environmental decline, and of course, corruption. And having worked in corporation or in the corporate setting for 2 decades, I figured I'd like to do something to help out.
So,
And so I,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
so I had the opportunity to join the Thai Institute of Directors as the executive vice president, and led their anti-corruption collective action movement until last year.
Well, I practiced law in Houston for 40 years, so I'm surprised our paths didn't cross at some point. Could you tell us about your role as the founder of the International Collective Action Network?
Yes, sure, Tom. So having been part of the Thai Collective Action Against Corruption, or Thai CAC, at the Thai Institute of Directors for about 7 years, I decided that during that time, the Thai CAC actually became known as one of the largest collective action against corruption in the world. I think we were sort of neck and neck with the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, MACD, sorry. And we had a lot of good innovations during that time that I was the project director. We grew our membership to over 500 members, certified members, and we had about close to 2,000 plus signatory members, which are companies are signing the pledge to join. Those are quite significant numbers, considering that elsewhere in the world, collective action often struggle to, even get a few dozen members on board. So realizing that other than increasing the numbers, we had embarked on a lot of programs. We were one of the first collective action to have a dual certification program for SMEs and large companies. We were one of the first to do online certification, paperless certification. We were the first to establish various level of certification for our members. When I decided to leave I thought that what would be better than to help other collective action accelerate and catalyze what they're trying to do, transferring from our past experience. And this is where the International Collective Action Network, ICANN, Fight Corruption for short, came together.
Lola, can I pitch it over to you?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Pana. Great to have you on this podcast because you take us back in time to a time when business-led or private sector-led efforts to tackle corruption was still very young and new. And it sounds like the Thai CAC under your leadership was like the learning platform for many of us, right? You were building that bicycle and you were riding it as you were building that bicycle, and we're watching and learning from you. But let me take you back a little bit to ask what inspired you to sort of dive deep into developing all those different streams of resources. Because, for instance, the MACN had a different model that was working for the maritime sector. And all of the other examples that, for anti-corruption collective action efforts certainly took different strategies around working with businesses. But the Thai CAC took a very strong hand-holding approach. What inspired that, and what have you learned from that you're taking with you to the ICANN now?
A great question, Lola. Actually, the Thai CAC did not start out being a certified body. The question around why did we take this approach? Actually, it was quite an evolution over a decade or more. And I think every collective action started with an organized effort to come together and work towards an anti-corruption mission. Now, initially, people or companies are just getting familiarized with the concept or are just trying to get their heads around, what does it mean with anti-corruption? What does it mean by having compliance? Really, in the formation stage, even with the Thai CAC, um, normally the organization is very loose in terms of what the members need to do or shall do. Maybe we'll come together and share best practices and talk about what a compliance program look like. And that's what CAC started out to be. So we had a informal declaration signing for members to join. Basically, it talks about how they should help in the fight against corruption, how they should put effort in building a clean and transparent organization. And there's several loose rules that they'd have to adhere by. And then the next step of the evolution came with the guidelines. We best practices from the UK and the Transparency International model and adopt I think 200 plus checklists and condense that down to about 71 checklists because we think that at the time, I really was trying to just take the first step. If you implement the tougher standards in the Western countries, it would be a no-go for our members. The second evolution was to try to simplify or make the compliance program practical, digestible, so that as many companies can follow. And then the third step of the evolution was that, well, when companies started to look at compliance, who's going to check if they're doing a good job? And so this is where the CAC also stepped in about 5, 6 years into the program to not only check, but if the companies meet our guidelines, we issue certifications on the companies. And then the fourth step of the evolution was to broaden the program to cover the SMEs and for the larger companies that have been certified multiple times, we have another higher role for them, which is to try to recruit their supply chain to become a CAC member as well. I think it's for every collective action elsewhere in the world, you may follow this sort of a progression in one way
Mhm.
or the other.
Mm-hmm. And Pana, just to drill down on that a little bit, where was the motivation or the drive or the demand coming from? Was it coming from members? Was it coming from investors, banks, the folks who worry about their return on investment and the integrity and security of their investment? Where was that motivation to move on to the next level, move on to getting guidelines, move on to the certification, then move on to the verification? Where was that pressure coming from?
At the time, we probably have to pull everything together to become both carrots and sticks. And so for the member companies, the carrots would be being part of the CAC is a little bit symbolic that they're part of a larger community that is clean and transparent and credible, dependable. And we try to maximize this aspect by giving them very formal, nice certifications. We have a certification giving ceremony. We publicize who's the member, and we try to publish success stories going out to the members, giving their CEOs and their chairman social media or public space to share their. The second carrot would be we try to go out to the government agencies and try to have them offer incentives for these companies that are within the Thai Sea. This was probably the most difficult
Mm-hmm.
and the most challenging part because as government agencies are slow and they don't adapt well to changes, some of them. And anytime you go make a special request to a particular sector, particularly group, they're leery of giving you such benefits. But we also try, and I think one of the things that became successful not only from our push but through other efforts of other civil society was the procurement standards, where you have to have certain anti-corruption policies in
Mhm.
place in order to bid for large infrastructure projects. And so that sort of plays into the favor of our certification members. The second angle is the stick, of course. And although we don't support big sticks, but what we try to do is work with the regulators to encourage, I would say encourage, positive pressure, put positive pressure on the listed companies to become CDC certified members. How do we do that? This was probably before my time. The Thai CAC managed to work with the Thai Stock Exchange of Thailand to disclose which members are part of CAC, which is not. So when
Mm.
investors look at the fact sheets of each listed companies, it will show prominently that yes, they're a member of Thai CAC. No, they're not part of the member. And this is where it puts positive pressure on the company to make efforts towards being certified.
Interesting. I like the small stick and the big carrot analogy. I want to go farther from the line of questioning that we sort of have to try to get into everything, or just to learn from the challenges and experiences that you had working on this. So I'll come back to ask about broadly what the challenges and experiences were, and I'd really want to have you talk a bit about what role the CAC now plays in Thailand and globally. But before I go there, let me stay here and ask you very quickly, in your time with the Thai CAC, did you experience companies that were certified and for some reason were involved in some unethical practices? It made the news. And how did you manage that? Because for many collective action programs, that's always something we're concerned about, having a certification that a company is committed to doing business without corruption. That's very aspirational. It's something we could try to do, but it's something you can't have full assurance of, right? So how has Thai CAC experienced over the last, I think, 10 years? What has the experience been like? Have you had companies that fell into that bucket and had to go through your incident reporting, and has that worked well?
Yes, so the quick short answer is yes. And we had companies that have been featured in the media that they were engaged in unethical practices. They were engaged in fraudulent practices, and certain individuals within the organization may be accused of bribery. And we have a couple of systems in place during the early years of the Thai CAC. The founders and the leaders at that time designed and implement a what they call the incident management process. And so it's basically a process which talks about what happens if these members become part of the accusation. How do we address the certification status and so on? So we have uh, pretty clear guidelines on what to do if there's such an event. The second component is that in order to decide what happens with the members, the Thai CAC uh, has a council, a group of highly respected individuals we call council. And also we have another committee called the certification committee that helps not only ask the right question, but makes the decisions on what happens with the members.
So some kind of investigation happens as part of the incident management. That's so interesting. Tom, I want to turn it back to you because I'm looking at the time, but permit me to ask one last question and maybe turn it back to you to I'm sure, chime in on several parts of this interesting conversation. Pana, I'm curious about what you think the future of collective action against corruption looks like. especially led by the private sector. Because now that you've done remarkable work building up the Thai CAC and now taking a lot of those learnings and supporting other collective action programs, I imagine you're seeing new things that you're thinking, if we had artificial intelligence at the time we started the Thai CAC, perhaps it could have ramped up faster how we did our training and certification. And so with all of the new ideas that are becoming part of anti-corruption collective action, including with private sector, working with civil society more than we used to, what is the future of anti-corruption collective action initiatives looking like? What 2 or 3 things would you say, if you're working on anti-corruption collective action, or if you're a business executive and you want to support anti-corruption efforts in your country and globally, learn about these 3 things?
Well, I think this is a great question. First of all, I think that for the private sector, we have to come to sort of an understanding that having anti-corruption or being part of the anti-corruption collective action is probably a license to operate in many countries before they may ask about the quality of your products, your human rights policy, your environmental policies. But what we're seeing and hearing from the private sector today is that they're asking, can we use the collective action certification as part of their compliance program for their partners, for their customers? First of all, I think this is the number one realization that I see, that the private sector is now seeing that anti-corruption is not a nice to have effort, but it's a license to operate. The second emerging trend is, I think, both from the practitioner perspective and the academic perspective, is we're investigating new tools to fight corruption. And you mentioned AI, Lola. I think in the future, AI could help with a number of things. For one, for example, corruption risk assessment. Although you think it might be easy for companies to try to assess their corruption risk, but believe me, having been part of the Thai CAC and trying to help companies do that, it's not an easy thing. And this is where AI could help detect and forecast what fraud risk they might foresee, the corruption risk might foresee, and so on. And the third thing is probably for the collective action in general. I think with the new tools in terms of collaboration, it has been very easy nowadays to share best practices, and I do that a lot with the ICANN initiative, having an hour of mentorship session with a company here and a company there. These knowledge transfers are very easy and convenient, and it helps accelerate and avoid making the same mistakes as we had in the past 10 years.
Mm. Mhm. Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Pana, I'm going to talk about Houston a little bit because it seems to me that many of the initiatives you've described, if they didn't come from your work at Shell, they may have been inspired. And I will introduce the question with the following. There were a lot of enforcement actions in the energy space. I worked at Halliburton, for instance. And the business response, what I saw was companies like Shell had gold standard compliance programs. Service companies who do the work with the producers also had compliance programs. Then I moved to a smaller service company and I was further down the chain, literally down to as a lawyer, I represented a $15 million software company that had one piece of software that did bolted onto something downhole that did something. And I convinced, and they were too small to have their own sales force. And so I convinced them that if you don't have a compliance program in place that's auditable, no one will work with you. No one will invest with you. And literally 2 weeks after they let me put a program in place, one of the service companies came along and made a big investment. And the second thing they asked for was, we want to see your compliance program. I say that as a way because my observation in Houston was the business response was, it started at the top, Shell, Exxon, Chevron, all had gold standard programs. The service companies put in programs, and literally everyone down the chain. And it wasn't just that you had a program, it was someone was going to look at it. They might come interview you, they might just do a document review, but someone was going to audit your program. And it seems to me what you put in place with the CAC is a business solution to perhaps a legal problem. As a lawyer, I would call corruption a legal problem, but you might call it a business problem. But it's a business solution. Would that be fair? And does that come out of your experience at Shell?
Part of, I guess, the accomplishment that we made or the achievements that we made at the Thai CAC probably came from Shell, in a sense that Shell and other oil companies have strict guidelines and standards on anything you do, I guess, even safety and environmental standards, and that it helps shape the way we think at the Thai CAC. But also, the other angle is that whatever compliance we put in place has to be practical and doable, because it doesn't matter how fancy you call it gold standard, but if it's platinum and nobody can actually conduct compliance or follow the standards, then it's just a bunch of papers on a table. So really there's actually three leg of a stool. The first one, of course, starts with a good compliance program. The second leg of the stool is the practice, of course. You have to really do what you wrote, right? And the third leg of the stool is the monitoring and the auditing. And without either one, I don't think you will achieve the full benefit of the any compliance program.
Well, Pana, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you to find out more information about the CAC or perhaps actually get involved, what might be the best places for them to go?
Certainly. As I'm no longer with the Thai CAC, you can contact me through my International Collective Action Network via LinkedIn. Just type in my first name and last name, and please feel free to message and connect me and discuss anything you have concern.
Pana, on behalf of Lola and myself, I wanted to greatly thank you. It heartens us both to be able to talk to a business person who is as passionate about compliance as we are, but equally importantly, bringing a business solution to this issue. So thank you. And I hope we both, or all three of us, can continue this conversation.
Thank you, Tom, to be on your program, and thank you, Lola.
Thank you, Pana.